Thank you, Jackie. So we are going to start this first panel debate. As Jackie has already said, we are going to discuss the situation today as regards economic and social convergence in the Union. It has already been said, the Commission has just published some weeks ago the 9th cohesion report, and there is a lot of interesting information in this report. Let me just highlight 2 or 3 key findings. The first, it has been already recalled by President von der Leyen and by Commissioner Ferreira. There has been an impressive catch-up process over the last 2 decades in the Union. The GDP per capita in Central and Eastern European countries has increased from about 62% of the EU average in 2004 to nearly 80% in 2023. So, as has been said, it has been a success. However, there are still remaining challenges. This convergence at national level hides increasing subnational disparities, particularly between large agglomeration areas and remote and rural regions. In addition to that, we have the problem of these trap regions, development trap regions that were already highlighted in the last cohesion report. That is, regions which have been in stagnation or economic decline over the last years or even decades. And now we have another type of trap, the talent development trap regions. These regions that have declining working age populations due to brain drain and due to aging populations. These regions can be found in less developed or more developed countries. And as regards to social convergence, the picture is also mixed. Let me give you some data. From 2016 to 2019, there has been a consistent decline in poverty rates in the Union. Yet the situation has remained unchanged since then. And now with the crisis, we have inflation, we have rising energy prices, which might jeopardize these social achievements. And as regards employment, labor markets have rebounded quite well after COVID, and disparities in employment rates between regions have also narrowed, but they still remain important. If you look at the youth unemployment rate, for instance, it is at 22% in less developed regions, which is almost twice the rate in more developed regions. So how worrying are all these trends and remaining challenges? How to tackle them? And particularly, what has to be the role of the cohesion policy in addressing this challenge? And to discuss this question, I'm very delighted to invite the panelists of this, the panelists of this debate, the panel. So I will invite them to come here to join me on the stage. So please come to the stage while I introduce you. We have first Mr. Yunus Omarjee, member of the European Parliament and chairman of the Committee on Regional Development in the European Parliament. We have also Mr. Sven Giegel, State Secretary at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action. Please take a seat. We have Mr. Loïc Chesnais-Girard, President of the Conference of Peripheral and Maritime Regions and also President of the Region Bretagne in France. We have Professor Simona Iammarino, Professor of Applied Economics at the Department of Economics and Business of the University of Cagliari in Italy, and also visiting professor at the London School of Economics. And finally, Professor Agnieszka Klon-Dominicas, Vice-Rector for Science and Director of the Institute of Statistics and Demography at the Warsaw School of Economics, and also member of the Committee on Demographic Studies of the Polish Academy of Science. Unfortunately, Mr. Elio Di Rupo, who was also in the panel, has had to cancel at the last minute, so he cannot be with us today. So I have asked the panelists to be brief so that we have time for putting some questions later on and also to receive some questions from the floor. I give first the floor to Mr. Omarjee. Please come ahead. No, you have to stay here.
Merci beaucoup de me donner la...
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Madam Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, I am not sure exactly what grades or what titles you have, but I'd like to say how pleased I am to be able to participate in today's 9th Cohesion Forum. I think that perhaps we should be asking one question, and that is, what would convergence amount to if we didn't have a cohesion policy? And at what cost would this lack of cohesion policy come? I think we said this yesterday. We talked about this with Commissioner Ferreira at the European Parliament, and I think this has been recalled again this morning. But I think that the successes of the cohesion policy are well known to us all. They're evident to everyone. We can see the amount of support that is given to companies. About 4 million companies have been supported through our policy, through our 2014-2020 programme period. And for the coming period, there's more than 1,300,000 jobs that have been created, or which will be created through this policy of cohesion. Now, having said that, we have yet got to recognize the number of disparities and distortions that still exist and which affect the European Union as a whole. I'll give you some examples which I believe are very eloquent. One is the level of inequality in income and inequality and economic inequality. In Bulgaria today, the average salary per capita is 20,700 euros a year. It's 92,000 a year in Luxembourg. So that shows that we still have a lot of work to do. And we have got to make tremendous efforts to look at salaries between the salary levels in the Western countries and the Centre and Eastern European countries. I think that the ambition of our cohesion policy has always been the glorious ambition of ensuring that we have greater equality, that our project is to create territorial equality and equity between the north, south, east and western parts of the European Union, within the centre, countries also on the periphery of the European Union. So the work that we have got to do to reduce these disparities is continuous, and we need to continue. We need to strengthen our efforts to ensure that we're able to do this within a new environment, which is sometimes a hostile environment, because, of course, cohesion policy is not the only instrument that comes into play. We have other policies at a European level or a more global level, or other policies which can also interfere with our objectives for cohesion policy. And so I'm going to give some thought to the idea that for us, for as long as there is poverty or social inequality within Europe, we cannot say that we are satisfied with our achievements. And in the European Union, at this present moment, there are about 100 million people in the EU who are threatened from poverty and social exclusion. So our efforts to fight against poverty are important today. And there are new forms of poverty today, urban poverty in rich areas of the European Union. We see pockets of poverty, and poverty has got to be a priority target for our policies. Inequality can be seen at all levels. We can see it at territorial level, and that's why when we say that our policy has got to be future oriented and has got to be focusing on this issue of territorialization. The reason that we say that is because we want to make sure that these differences between different zones can be ironed out. And I think that this is really what we've got to focus on. Development is less obvious in the mountainous areas, in the peripheral areas, or in areas which are far from the metropolitan centres, which still attract more investment than other areas. The 9th Cohesion Report was put forward recently, and we've started to look at this. It is part and parcel of it is part of the continuous study of the cohesion policy coming after the 8th Cohesion Report. But what we have seen is that where there is where we're seeing a deindustrialization, we're seeing a lag behind in many areas. We've seen this in particular in countries in the south of Europe. They are countries which have paid the highest price and which have seen the greatest loss of industry and deindustrialization. So we need to reindustrialize Europe. That should be one of our objectives today, and it is for our cohesion policy. And the step regulation that we adopted is a very clear sign of the priority that we set by this aim of reindustrializing the regions of Europe. Taking on board, of course, the territorial differentiation. And the second lesson that we have learned from the 9th cohesion report is something you've mentioned already, and that is the question of regions which are underdeveloped at present. We have seen the maps that were presented today, which shows us we have the president of the region of Brittany with us today, and we can see the very worrying situation in France, where nearly all of the regions are in a situation where they are stagnating today. So we need to act on that problem as well. And then just to conclude, let me say that the question of future enlargement is going to be a key issue for us in the next mandates. Now, I don't want to be dogmatic in saying whether we should be for or against enlargement. I think what's important is that we look at the reality that we are confronted with today. The new enlargement, including the Balkans and the Ukraine, will actually require about 65 billion euros as a budget to meet the challenges of this enlargement in cohesion terms. And that is going to mean a drop in about 20% of our cohesion budget if we don't find a new source of financing. And that takes me to the essential part of this, the key matter. It is the budget, because we will not be able to reach our common goals, the goals that we all share, if we're not able to very quickly find a larger budget for our cohesion policy, which is in step with the challenges that we are confronted with and which we have touched on during the this cohesion forum. Thank you.
I will now pass the floor to Mr. Giegold. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. It's great to be back to Brussels, and it's great to see you, Elisa, in particular. And thank you for inviting me to that forum. So indeed, the 9th cohesion report points out impressive achievements. It demonstrates the need for cohesion policy, and I agree with Enrico. There is no common market without cohesion policy, and cohesion policy is the basis and the backbone for further integration of the common market, which we need to do faced to growing global challenges and a tougher competition at the global stage in geopolitically more difficult times. So the common market is one of the greatest assets of our path to political integration. And in order to secure that the common market is democratically, socially, and economically performing, we need cohesion policy. And therefore, for the leading ministry in Germany on cohesion policy, I would stress the support of our government to cohesion policy and of our ministry, of course, as well. And as a main contributor to the budget, as well as one of the main receivers of cohesion funds, I would like to share some reflections with you on which consequences we may draw from the 9th cohesion report. So I would like to concentrate on 4 quick issues. So first, greater importance on effectiveness, a stress on transition, a link with structural reforms, and participation and red tape. So first, when it comes to effectiveness and impact, and you have immediately pointed out, and Enrico did it as well, we have a tension between growing expectations on Europe and limited resources and budget constraints, and a reduction of willingness to share resources, and therefore we have to face this issue without naivety. What I would like to denounce is to basically artificially stress certain elements like enlargement or defense or the ecological transition, only to name a few, as well as industrial competitiveness, and play it against cohesion policy or other things which Europe has done successfully. So we have to face that there is a budget constraint, and at the same time there are these legitimate expectations. And one is not going against the other, but we have to face how can we use everything we do so that several objectives are at the same time accomplished with the same resources. And second, and I agree, how can we find additional resources for which we have already decided that we want to have more own genuine resources for the European Union. If we only ask member states with empty pockets to contribute more to the European Union, it will not fly. So we need to make real progress on genuine own resources, while at the same time being more effective how we spend our money. And this means that we have to look for double and triple functionality of resources. And this is, of course, very important when it comes to the way how we do cohesion policy. We have a lot of studies on what we do on the project level. We have only few effective implementation studies which on the macro level prove, and perhaps academics will prove us that I'm wrong, but our impression is actually we know relatively little how effective we are in macro terms, and we need to build the data and the basis for that research so that we know better how to do cohesion in the most effective way. Second, the focus on transition. Digital transition and ecological transition is a reality, and this means it will be key for the future of our economies. We have to strive for sustainable competitiveness. We cannot avoid that this pressure is not only hitting the poorest regions, but as you pointed out, some of the regions which were strong in old industries are now some of the regions in difficulty. So we have to take seriously that rich regions which at the moment look alive and healthy could be in trouble if they get transition wrong. And therefore, we continue to insist that the goals of the green and digital transitions have to be at the heart of the future cohesion policy, which also means that this is, of course, a challenge for all of us, which is also important because it's also part of the legitimacy of the cohesion budget, that it's felt everywhere in Europe, but not to the same extent according to the respective wealth. Then I would also like to insist that we need more binding development strategies, which have to be built in a participatory approach in the different regions, and in order to tackle transition more effectively through targeted investments which are matching the respective challenges. This should be built in a participatory approach using often used but not always widespread participatory methods such as community-led development. I would also like, third, to insist that one of the results of the 9th cohesion report shows that even the largest cohesion budget will not work if structural reforms are not done effectively. Many speak in Brussels now whether the RRF approach was not much better than what we did with cohesion, where the link with reforms was more biting and more binding. We can learn from RRF, but we should not put into a dustbin the established good principles which work well for cohesion, such as shared management, the territoriality principle, and also the respective links. We also can learn from RRF, like the performance-based approach. We are ready to speak about it, but let's be honest. We also should speak about what didn't work so well with RRF. So I'm still struggling to understand how the Commission and the Italian government could ever approve the superbonus. This needs to be explained, because if we want reforms to be more conditioned, the funds more conditioned on reforms, we need institutions which are able to put effective conditions. And if they are not able to do so, and they end up like a paper tiger, like much of the European semester, then of course this will not work. And therefore we need an honest debate about the effectiveness of these conditions. However, linking cohesion and structural reform is good. And last, cutting red tape is a key objective of the current Commission. It will be a key challenge for the next one. And also cohesion needs to face this challenge to make this, in particular for smaller actors, more effective, while not being soft where you have problems of clientelism and corruption. So I think we have a lot of challenges. Let's work together to make a good policy like cohesion even greater. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Giegold. I now give the floor to Mr. Chesnes-Guillard.
Madame la commissaire Ferreira.
Commissioner Ferreira, it's a pleasure to see you again, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends. It really is a pleasure and an honor for me to be here to speak to you today and to take forward the point of view of the peripheral and maritime regions. The economy currently is forcing us to ask a lot of questions for the upcoming years and to think about the climate situation, the economic situation, the geopolitical situation. These subjects will be at the heart of our concerns in the upcoming months after the European elections. And they will, of course, become very central to cohesion policy issues. Thank you to those who've taken the time to read the cohesion report. It puts forward the necessary balance that was struck from the very beginning between the freedom of a single market and the obligation to have proper cohesion policy in place. Now, this is something that we can all recall, but there are a number of elements that we need to look at given the upcoming developments. The first striking point, and Commissioner Ferreira mentioned it already, we have convergence among member states. That is an aim, but we also need to look at convergence within member states. In the areas where there are territorial disparities within member states and within regions themselves. That's something that's really important that we need to keep in mind. If we don't pay attention to this, then we will be creating imbalances. We'll cause a loss of trust and a loss of hope. And I think it's very important for us in the upcoming years to remember to have a big macro overall view of the situation, but also to focus on the inside of states so that we can ensure that the right conditions are there for balance and the hope of our populations. As Yunus Omarjee was saying earlier, one of the issues is income, salaries, work, employment. We're seeing a re-industrialization in Europe, which is a wonderful opportunity for some regions, especially while we try to make our industries more low carbon to try and meet our climate goals. But we also need to look at GDP. Employment and resources aren't aren't everything. We need to look at quality of life. We need to look at universities. We need to look at social policy, infrastructure, or other elements that allow for proper cultural and social life. So it's very important for all of us to ensure that the cohesion policy supports this. And it's incredibly important to say it and say it again. I don't think you can have freedom of movement of our citizens in Europe if you don't have the right to go and live where you want to live. If our citizens, if our young people are not able to go and live or stay and live where they want to live, if they are pushed into hubs of high growth or high employment possibilities where there's greater wealth, if we're pushing them to certain areas, we're going to pauperize other areas in the EU. And we'll be pushing people outside of the EU. We'll be creating risks. Internally, there'll be a loss of hope and a loss of shared desire to go forward together as an EU. So what we need is a strong Europe, and we need strong cohesion policy to have strong Europe. And there are two very important points that I would like to make at this point. The CPMR really wants to draw your attention to two issues. The first is the role of local authorities, regions that take forward cohesion policy. It's important to mention it, because in many member states, especially the one where I come from, France, we often see that there is a desire to bring back various responsibilities by re-centralizing powers within states. That is a temptation. In COVID, for example, it was necessary to have policies rolled out quickly and easily. But what we're dealing with now is 450 million people, 200 regions that need help, that need support, and each and every one of them will have to come up with their own strategy to help people, to help the economy, and to act using the cohesion policy. It's really important. And the second point is the challenge of enlargement. We need to bear in mind at all times that it's important to have a desire to enlarge the EU. We in the CPMR have a number of our own members who are from member states, candidate states rather, to the EU. And so enlargement is something that we want to pursue. But it's important to remember that there needs to be a collective effort to ensure that enlargement doesn't create an imbalance in the current configuration of the EU, that we don't cause people to lose hope and to lose the desire to work towards this project. So those are the 2 points that are important for us, the CPMR. We would like to see proposals around these 2 topics, and I think it's very important. If we want to maintain prosperity, we need to maintain balance and hope, and cohesion fund is one of the main elements to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I now give the floor to Professor Iammarino. It works. No, it works well. Oh,
Works,
yeah.
yeah? Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a big honor for me to be here today. Cohesion policy has worked, and academic evidence on this is absolutely uncontroversial. I mean, we have seen convergence at the national level. We have seen the biggest enlargement of the Union that foreign observers said it would fail, and it didn't, and we are all here together. So cohesion policy has helped a lot, counterbalancing all the effects of the latest shocks, and we have seen many. However, I want to draw your attention on the problem of regional disparities that are still there, and particularly the regional development traps that also the Commissioner Ferreira has recalled, because in front of the possible and likely enlargement of the future become really crucial point if we really want to translate and turn hope into action. The regions that are in the regional development traps are those regions that have been unable, some for a very long time, to retain their past economic vitalism and dynamism in terms of income, in terms of productivity and employment. And they have been underperforming also in relation to the national and the European average. These regions come from all levels of income, where former very high income regions that have been have witnessed their activities and industries go away, offshored, outsourced in other parts of the world. They have been past poor regions that have been growing very fast and then never reached the European average and been stuck below. And then many, many regions that have been at the middle income level for decades, and they are still there. So this growing number of regions, and this is a study that we have been doing with my colleague Andreas Rodriguez-Pose, that is there somewhere, Andreas Dimmer and Michael Storper, have been wedged between the rich regions, dynamic, highly technological, and the poorest region, helped a lot by cohesion policy, precisely because it is aimed at ensuring cohesion. But these regions are those that don't see much future and opportunities even in the transitions that we are facing. So the likelihood of being in a development trap is one that is particularly evident in the regions of France, particularly in the northeast and central France, in Italy, Italy central, but sometimes also north and south, Lisbon, in the area, metropolitan area of Lisbon, some of the poor regions or island, actually, a small island in Greece and Spain. In Northern Europe, these traps, or the risk of being in a trap, is not actually that much visible. France and Italy are also the region, the countries that shows the largest number of regions at high risk of becoming trapped, followed by Greece and Spain. So I want to stress, it is a problem of the southern Europe, as it is already been mentioned. And enlargement, further enlargement, will present a big problem also in terms of political choices of these trapped regions. Many trapped regions have been there for a very long time. Since the big crisis of 2009, they have been into recession. Since then, went through austerity and still, not recovering. So it's a very, very long time. France and Italy also display the highest intensity of the trap, and this means that the extent to which basically regional growth has been lower compared to the benchmarks. There should be some maps here behind me to show what I'm saying. However, the set of problems that we see has a dual nature, and I will stress what, according to me, are the most important. One set of factors associated with the regional development trap are endogenous, and particularly, I want to stress insufficient institutional responsiveness to change, which translate in low propensity to innovate and therefore to be competitive, especially at a time of shift in technological paradigms. Technological transition, I'm focusing on technological transition, digital, AI, and on the other hand, climate change, renewable energy, green transition. Because history tells us that at the time of technological paradigm change becomes very fast and more radical. And therefore, it is important to have institutions that are quick to adapt to change. On the other hand, this goes hand in hand with the quality of skills and the type of skills that one region has. More generally, the education level. Yes. So these are two factors that are very, very important, and that, you know, addressing these challenges requires, obviously, sustained long-term investment, policy coherence across areas, and also collaboration at local, regional, and national level. One final factor that I want to mention is exogenous, and it's connectivity in terms of globalization forces. And this has been a factor probably not taken into account enough. Many of these regions have been seeing their activities go elsewhere, and interdependence, I mean, towards the rest of the world is fundamental. We have to take into consideration that is not only brain drain, but lack of attractiveness to foreign investor, foreign talent, foreign capital has been absolutely vital. And that these regions that are trapped actually are marked by a different new form of peripherality, which is being excluded from global trends. So to finish, digital transition, green transition will offer new windows of opportunities. But if we do not address this and build institutional capacity for change, which is different from quality of institution as we measure nowadays, these regions will be trapped, continue to be trapped, vote far-right populism, and work against us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Villamarino. So now I'm passing the floor to Mr. Clon Dominicas. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. We've mentioned the issue of climate change and digital transition. There's social cohesion is very much also dependent on what happens with population and demography and demographic transition. Commissioner Ferreira mentioned the talent trap regions, the regions that have shrinking working age population. And it is important to underline that the shrinking working age population is a result of many demographic processes that are intertwined and interrelated and highly complex. And I would like in my intervention to mention some of those developments that are related to fertility, formation, breakdown on families, changes in mortality, life expectancy, internal and foreign migrations, that affect social cohesion at national, regional, subnational levels, and good cohesion policy needs to take into account these demographic processes and development. So when we look at fertility, the fertility in Europe is basically below replacement of generations, below 2.1, and definitely it will most definitely, according to the knowledge that we have, it will not return to the levels that guarantee the replacement of generations. However, if we think about adjusting family policies to the needs of the young people, that might help them to support the realization of their parental aspirations and have some impact on improving fertility levels. That includes housing policies, access to the labor market, access to childcare, but also promoting equal division of work, not only within the labor market, but also within the families and between partners. President von der Leyen mentioned in her speech the creation of childcare places using the cohesion funds. She mentioned many childcare places created in Poland. I can give an example of one small city in the eastern Poland, Sejny, when creation of childcare facility for children below ages of 3 helped to improve employment of young women in that particular city and help to reduce the outflow of migrations to the bigger cities with bigger development. So these are the examples of policies that work and that definitely should be continued. When we look at health and mortality, this is another challenge that we should be very much aware of, and especially the COVID pandemic caused significant deterioration of health, resulting in large population losses in Europe, which was again uneven. So Poland was a country that recorded probably one of the highest number of deaths that were excessive deaths because of the COVID and also interrelated factors. There's increasing incidence of mental illness, various kinds of unhealthy behaviors that also should be considered. When we think about population policies, these are also migrations. And again, when we look at challenges related to migrations, then they can be divided into the fact that we observe changing foreign migration flows. Russian invasion to Ukraine caused a massive inflow of migrants, and Poland, again, was the country that absorbed, especially the first stage, a majority of those migrants. And again, it's not territorially equal. So the large cities welcomed majority of the migrants that were coming. And that is also a challenge for the cohesion policy, because we think about integration of those people to the labor market, but also education policy, housing, and challenges to housing. So when we take an example of Warsaw, the city I come from, with a huge inflow of migrants, that also meant that, for example, housing prices, rental prices increased. That causes consequences for the large academic community, student community in Warsaw, that all of a sudden faced also the challenge of increasing housing prices when they came to study to Warsaw. So again, many consequences of policies that need to be taken into account. There are also internal migrations. So when we think about shrinking working age population, it's not only because of the processes that happen in place, but also some of the regions, some of the localities that are less attractive also cause this out-migration. So we have some peripheral regions that suffer because of population aging and the working age population shrinking, not only because of the natural processes, fertility and mortality, but also migration for work, migration for education. So we have many municipalities that depend basically on the transfers from public finance. There is little economic development that can support increased income from taxes or from the companies. This process of the demographic disintegration of those rural areas, especially in small towns, in some of the regions, in many countries, is also the one that requires attention from the cohesion policies. So population aging and demographic changes are strongly spatially differentiated. There are old areas, let's say, population speaking, young areas, and they require different kinds of policies. Many policies are aspatial. When we think about education, social insurance, health, transport, care system, we need to add this spatial aspect and the local aspect to those. And finally, last but not least, with all the population aging policies, we also need to think about social investment, about building human capital, building talents. That is an important part to counteract the consequences of the population changes that we are all facing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. John, Dominika. So thank you all the panelists. You have raised plenty of issues. I mean, we have talked about enlargement as one of the main challenges in the future. We have talked about basic income divergences that are still retain our attention. We have talked also about these traps, these development traps that are also important. We have talked about whether or not cohesion is effective, and also on the need to focus on transitions, but also on the role of national policies in creating or not more internal divergences. And finally, on the possibility to draw lessons from the RF for the next EU cohesion policy. Let me pose you some questions before going to the floor, asking the question to the floor. Maybe I can start with you, Mr. Omar G. We are heading toward elections in less than 2 months. We have heard about many different priorities for EU cohesion policy, and normally this is one criticism that we listen when we talk about the role of EU cohesion policy, that it has a lot of objectives. What should be the key message for citizens? What should be the priority of the next EU cohesion policy? Ça marche.
Ça marche.
That's a very complicated question, or at least there's a complicated answer. And there's a very very obvious reason for this. I think that what the citizens are expecting of us are clear answers to the real-life difficulties that they are feeling today. We're in the electoral campaign right now, and I am very aware of the fact, as I said in Mons, that the success that we can point to across the board actually amounts to nothing because of the difficulties and the suffering that many populations in Europe are suffering, and in particular those who have actually been left behind in this process. When you go to people's houses during the electoral campaign, what they want to talk to you about is the problems of inflation, purchasing power, housing, the energy precarity that they're suffering from, increase in transport problem and prices. These are all the problems that citizens are feeling. And trying to talk to them about cohesion policy, and I don't think there's any other policy in the European Union that is so close to the citizens as cohesion policy. But as I said earlier, for as long as we still have poverty, difficulties with purchasing power, difficulties in finding housing, for as long as we have those problems, then there's going to be a lot of work ahead of us. And we're going to have to continue setting our priorities on those challenges, on precisely these challenges, trying to reduce inequalities. And the question of inequality, that really is the main question at both global level and also at union level. And that really is the path we need to take if we want to try and ensure that people do not think that the European institutions' actions are not meeting the needs and the wishes of the population at large. So that's my first impression. It's really, how are we going to ensure that we can improve living conditions of our citizens? And then as far as the European project is concerned, the promise of equality in living conditions is quite simply an extraordinary promise to make, but we've got to keep our promise. We see sometimes that that distortions may continue to strengthen in certain areas, and that should make us think twice about what we're doing and where changes are required. A lot is said about how we can reform cohesion policy, but I think that we need to reform a number of other European policies. And that's really where the heart of the subject lies. Economic policy, for example, you talked about structural reforms earlier. I think that all policies should be supporting cohesion policy, even the European semester. Because otherwise, what we create with one policy, we destroy with another. And the treaties really are pushing us to achieve this. Social cohesion, territorial cohesion, economic cohesion, this is not simply a question of regional policy, but by all European policies. And as the president of the region of Brittany has said, we need to ensure that these objectives are also set by the national governments as well, and at regional level as well. There is a need for these policies to be supported so that they are successful for the local populations. Thank you.
I speak to English. that gives me the opportunity to switch to your colleague, Mr. Giegold, because you say, and Mr. Chesnas-Girard also has said, there is a responsibility of the national authorities in preventing major imbalances. You are the only representative of a national government here, so maybe the question is for you, what should national governments do in terms of cohesion?
Well, starting perhaps with the fact that there's not one size fits all, because we have to be humble as a German federal government, because we have, for good reasons, the multi-level principle, and this is in particular true for Germany. So the main responsibility for cohesion in Germany is not with the federal level. We are only coordinating the policies towards ELISA and the institutions here, but in fact, it's the regions which have responsibility. And one, if I may say that, perhaps is also a reason why our map looks a bit different, because we are not so centralized in economic development policies. So each region defines its own operational plans, discusses this with the Commission. We help, we coordinate, we learn from each other in Germany, and then there's of course also the responsibility of local authorities. And this is very important to make the whole thing effective. And therefore our coordination role is now to help, for instance, the debates towards the next cohesion period. We will also help, of course, with some administrative questions, but there is a lot of regional responsibility. And therefore, I have to see the big differences of regions. And what you were saying was stressing that problem. And some of you stressed the problem of peripheral regions. And I would like only to share one experience we had with cohesion in this regard. So, as you know, Germany has an aggressive policy to converting its energy system towards renewable energy. And what peripheral regions very often have is space. And space can be turned into value added with renewable energy. Unlike a more centralized version of energy provision, renewable energy and storage can help regions to find new revenue. And this is what we can see in Germany. So much more money, and we have a calculation about this, much more value added than what we ever funded with regional policy, be it German, regional, or European money, has been put to peripheral regions in Germany by renewable energy. The irony only is that some of the rules of the EU forbid Germany to use EU cohesion funds for renewable energy because the Commission found we have already too much of it, which I find quite funny. We can fund it elsewhere, but I would only like to say there is also a case. Yes, Elisa, it's like this. But I want to say there is huge opportunity by energy transition and by circular economy for marginal regions. And we should fund this, we should support these regions in being leaders in the transition, and by this way profit also economically and have an economic force to counter some of the challenges in migration and labor mobility.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chesnais-Girard, I go to you now. I mean, we have been talking about RRF and the lessons to be drawn from the mode of delivery of RRF to EU cohesion policy. Mr. Giegold was saying we can draw some lessons and we can learn some performance-based approach while keeping the IDN of the principles of the EU cohesion policy. We have also heard President von der Leyen talking about combining investments and reforms, and Commissioner Ferreira saying that we have to draw lessons. What exactly we have to take from RRF to EU cohesion policy?
Écoutez, nous avons vraiment besoin.
Well, what we need to do is to ensure that this cohesion policy does take on board the various challenges that we face. That's the environmental transition, development of territories, while still being flexible enough in our regions. You know, this decentralization is really important, and that's why I mention it again. In France, we look towards Germany quite a lot. And often I say if we could look at the deficit rate of our states and compare that to the decentralization rate, we might be able to find some solutions for countries such as mine, because we have 4% of the national spending are spent on regions, but that's just a side note. So what we need is European ambition, because the sum of local ambitions will not be enough. We need a European ambition on progress, on the ecological transition, on our sovereignty, on defense. All of that is really important. And at the same time, we need to support pride in our regions, because all of our regions, the peripheral regions, have new opportunities given the new challenges, because they're close to the ocean, which is a considerable source of energy. Also because they're close to the sea, they're open to the world and can therefore be key in, international trade aspects, for example. It's important for the EU not to shut down and look at itself, but has to be open to the world. We need the right infrastructure, of course. Roads. This is something we need to talk about. We need to talk about rail freight, about railways, optical fiber, roads. All of this is very important, especially in peripheral regions. If you want a very high standard of living, you need good mobility, which means we also need to look at planes in some peripheral areas, because people won't want to stay in these areas if they're not well connected. So we need to have a European state of mind, but while working on local strategies in each and every one of our European regions. And these strategies need to be based on our strengths and weaknesses to decide for the future.
Professor Iammarino, you have said that EU cohesion is effective. At the same time, we see that a lot of these regions in development trap have been for a long time in development trap, and some of them have received massive EU cohesion funds. What's the problem? What we have to do differently?
Well, what's the problem? I said. I mean, it is very visible. I'm Italian, so I'm entitled to talk about Italian Mezzogiorno and not only, right? I mean, one thing is to talk about institutional quality. We measure that, but it's very imperfect. It's perception of people on how good hospitals and schools are. But this is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about responsiveness to change, which means having a public administration, a public service governance that is made up by young, capable, with PhD people that are able to respond immediately to a constant kind of input from outside and take a vision that is integration, that is multicultural, that is precisely prone to meet the challenges of climate, the challenges of digital, AI, while what we observed, and this is visible in Italy, but it's visible in France, where the quality of institution is higher, according to the index, or in some region of Spain, of Greece, that capacity is really non-existent because public sectors have basically absorbed people that were skilled in a different time, in a different century, I would say, and whose capacities are not in line with the need of today. So this is the main problem. I mean, we have invested a lot in smart specialization. Smart specialization is working, but where is working? Is working where there is this institutional capacity. And to build that, we need to rethink education and talent making, possibly also being attractive. So it's a very difficult task. I mean, as my colleague was saying.
Thank you very much. And now I pass to your colleague, actually, Mr. Clon-Dominica, because you have touched upon one of the big issues now, demographic change, and you have very well explained that this is different from one region to the other, even within the same country, actually. And the Commission is now putting forward this new map of talent development traps, and it has also put forward some proposals how to help these regions. What's your vision about that, about the proposals of the Commission, how to help these talent development trap regions?
I think it's a very good idea because the cohesion issue is not only about economic development, but it's also about social development and human capital. And if we don't have skilled people, if we don't have talent, it's very difficult to sustain any kind of economic development. And that is exactly what is needed. Of course, the devil is in the details. As I have mentioned, creating talent and retaining talent requires also good infrastructure, good policies that help those young people, talented people, to stay in a place and to contribute with their talent to the development. So this is a long-term kind of a policy, and it is very important to invest in talent and to invest in retaining talent and into this kind of social cohesion of talents that exists. So the idea is good. I hope it will be long-lasting, and I hope that those regions will be able also to learn from each other. There are pilot programs that I hope will serve the rest of those regions that are covered by the program to design their ideas fit to the needs of the local situation.
Thank you very much. We are running a bit out of time, but we have still some time for questions on Slido. So, Jackie, what's going on Slido?
Lots and lots is happening on Slido. We won't be able to cover all the ground, but they fall into some broad areas. Many, many questions, more than anything else, about the RRF. And someone saying how to improve the efficiency with a centralized RRF style instrument while maintaining place-based and territorial dimension in future cohesion policy. Can you do both? Someone else saying, why do we keep talking about renationalising? Why all this focus on centralisation? Strong regions have strong local actors and functioning local administrations. We need more subsidiarity, more autonomy. A question really linked to what you were asking, Loïc, earlier about how do we, member states are reporting positively on some aspects of RRF, negatively on others. How do we import the most productive elements but avoid some of the things that are not going on? So lots there. And just a comment from someone saying, why do people think RRF is easier for us? This questioner says, and I quote, implementation is exactly the same as cohesion policy on the ground for beneficiaries. So that's a whole area. Next one, links with other policies, references to the European semester. How do you incorporate the country-specific references? Education, developing education systems alongside poverty, tourism, lots of policy areas. Development traps have also come up. People asking, building on what you were talking to Agnieszka about some of these development trap regions have been there for a long, long time. Is more of the same the answer? How do we get out of that? Oh, have we been ignoring the persistence of it? And very lastly, a lovely question from someone saying, what is the one thing that you as panelists think should change, if you had to identify one thing, if we are to take stock of past experiences and to improve? So lots of ground,
Okay.
pick up on whatever you fancy.
Who wants to take this marvelous question of what is the one thing to change on EU cohesion policy? Someone, shall I force you to answer the question? Maybe you, Mr. Giegold, I see that... or maybe I can ask you about RRF. I mean, try to be precise. What exactly we have to draw from RRF to the new EU cohesion policy?
Well, first, I did not plead for centralizing the thing. That was not what I wanted to say. I agree that, and I stressed it, the importance of shared management, multi-level system of cohesion, the co-financing principle, which secures also the right incentives to put the right investment and the place-based approach, including participation. So these principles, they are legitimate. What RRF, from my perspective, has mainly added is that we know, also from the cohesion report, that on a local level you can fund as many local authorities and enterprises and civil society initiatives as you want. If the macroeconomic policies are bad, And if the institutions are bad, this will not lead to persistent development. And therefore, it's so important to strengthen in member states the actors of reform. And this RRF has managed because there were ex-ante conditionalities, and these ex-ante conditionalities have strengthened in member states those people who wanted anyway to make certain important reforms for the future of the countries. And then, of course, afterwards, I agree with what you were saying, the management of the funds is not so structurally different, but these ex-ante conditionalities were helpful. And there's, of course, one problem to be solved. What do we do if member states, be it because of not respect of these ex-ante conditionalities, or because they have persistence rule of law problems, do not get access to the funds, and then you have victims in enterprises, civil societies, local authorities. For this problem, a solution has to be found. But these ex-ante policy links, they are helpful, and they are, from my perspective, from our perspective, a logical consequence of the findings of the cohesion report.
Thank you very much. What's the vision of the European Parliament, the Committee on Regional Development, particularly on that?
The whole committee.
The
Bien.
whole committee.
Je vais sortir un peu du cadre.
Well, let me move out of the beaten path for a second and just say what it is that we're talking about today. I think the problem is that we are at a turning point when it comes to the future of European policies, especially for the cohesion policy. This is not something new. It doesn't come from yesterday. You know, for many years now, we have in our committee said that there is a risk of renationalization of European policies. And the question that we all need to ask at the moment is who is sacrificing Europe-wide solutions? Who will today already mourn the objectives and the aims of the social cohesion and territorial policies? I think the RRF does present various advantages. It has shown how the EU, in times of crises, even if there is a bit of a taboo, manages to find solutions. But at the same time, this Resilience and Recovery Fund is thought and designed and implemented in a way in which it actually ignores the cohesion aims. So the questions that we will have to ask our heads of state and government during future negotiations is whether they are in favor of centralization, whether they are willing to put aside the cohesion objectives and base our policy on other instruments which also don't take into consideration these objectives of cohesion and will probably bring other objectives to bear. We've spoken about the difficulties faced by European citizens, by territories and regions and peripheral areas that are struggling to develop, they're struggling to keep up. I think that structural reforms, especially the European semester objectives, which make public services in Europe more fragile, do not actually lead to a situation where across Europe in all the regions, especially those that are a little bit further away and have demographic issues, can converge as quickly as possible. That's not what we're seeing. So it really is a very important time. That's why the Committee of the Regions and the European Parliament together have a very offensive, aggressive approach to say that the cohesion policy architecture, with the coherence across 27 member states, with its shared objectives to try and reduce any distortions on a macro level and also within member states, is something that needs to be our main priority. If not, then what we will see is not only that the EU will be more and more fragile, that this policy would be more and more vulnerable, and the idea of the EU itself will become more and more fragile. And this, of course, will have to be combined with the crises that we're seeing in values and our ideology. You'll see new political power play within the European Parliament in the near future, and these will also continue to influence the European Council. So it really is an important, dangerous, risky time for all of those who believe in our policies, who believe in our territories, our regions, our cities, the beneficiaries of our policies. All of those people need to make sure that their voice is heard, and they need to act. The last thing I will say is that what I see is when we look at the CAP, the agriculture and farming lobby makes its voice heard, knows how to act. You know, we might see tractors lining the streets. They know exactly what to do. When it comes to cohesion, it's more complicated. It's not quite the same situation. We're looking at institutions. It's institutions that support this policy. And I think it's very important to mobilize anybody and everybody that believes in this policy, anyone who works on the ground, in the cities, in the regions, in the territories, economic beneficiaries, anyone who believes in this should come forward and support the European MEPs in the future at the elections.
I think, Mr. Chesney-Girard, I wanted also to pose you another question. It's the question of the simplification. What we have heard people saying, why people say that RF is simpler than cohesion? But go ahead.
Effectivement, ce sujet de simplification.
Well, yes, I think that I don't want to simplify things, because simplification is not centralisation. What I said earlier is the fact that simplification seemed to come with the relance budget fund. So the simplification is not the same as regionalisation. So I think we've got to make sure that we leave the powers to the regional authorities, and we've got to try and not actually forget about the people who are the mayors, heads of companies, presidents of associations, who actually develop these projects and who can actually push these projects with cohesion funds. But if the file takes a certain time to get off their ground, given the amount of high interest rates that are applied today, then we're giving a very bad image of the European Union. And we are not serving the policy that the Commission wants to develop, or the policy that we wish for within cohesion policy. So I think that in the future, we've got to remember that the simplification of the process does not necessarily mean that we're going to reduce the risk of bad payments or fraud. I think we've got to be very careful to make sure that we actually target properly who we're giving the aid to. There can be a simplification which could actually mean that we qualify those collectivities or bodies that actually distribute the funds. So the bodies that distribute the funds are well known to the institutions, to the Commission, because they do distribute funds, and we know the level of error or fraud that's involved with these paying agencies. So we can't actually, we've got to make sure that these agencies have a certain level of competence and are serious in their nature, so that they can actually manage these funds correctly. But perhaps we should give a little bit more flexibility to these bodies, and make sure also that outside the capitals people can speak of Europe more clearly.
Claude, Domenica, and Professor Iamarino, do you want to say something about this question of centralization? Because both of you have addressed, you have mentioned national policies that have an impact for these regional development traps. Education policy, healthcare. Some of them are at regional level, some of them are at national level. So how do you see this question of what is the role of EU cohesion policy? What is the role of, or we have to centralize to do things better?
Well, I mean, this goes back to a point that I wanted really to make here. I mean, what I really hope is a new generation of, for example, smart specialization strategies, so obviously place-based, and we always advocating that, I mean, aimed at revitalizing, regenerating. However, I mean, not only focused, and this probably has been too much in this stuck and trapped region, to change industry structure in order to make it more innovative, more complex, more high-tech, because that doesn't work where there is no precisely institutional capacity to bring this change and skills that are adequate to make this change. So it is decentralization at the same time accompanied by a bottom-up approach is great, but has to be somehow compensated and calibrated depending from the region, depending from the, because openness and reaction also to transition, technological transition and globalization need a vision that cannot be local, because the local vision is very focused, is very narrow, too narrow sometimes. So, a sort of integrated policy. And my colleague was saying precisely, education is key, but education is done at a very high level, and so doesn't address what is, forming the local capacity to react promptly to change more and more in the next future.
Yes, but education policies have an impact. I think I would like to mention 2 points. I'm sorry, it's very difficult to focus on one. If we look, for example, of what happened with education system in Poland over the past few years, with a change of the structure of education system, that had a huge impact on the social cohesion and the local development, because our lower secondary schools were cancelled, and instead we had extended primary schools development. What it means for the smaller rural communities, that one good lower secondary school that took children from all the local communities, had very good infrastructure, had very good teachers, and was a leverage for those kids to really have access to good knowledge, good skills, good teachers, was diluted down to local primary schools. So some of those good teachers stayed, but they didn't teach all of the kids around, but only some of the kids around. So that is an example of a central policy that has huge implications at the local level that are very difficult to be fully assessed. The other thing is indeed the local capacity. Even if we pour regions with the money, if we don't have people that are able to write a project proposal, they will not get those money. So the question is how to mobilize the capital at the local level. Many years ago, I think 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, we had one program at the Ministry of Labour and Social Policy in Poland that focused on 500 poorest, most distant local communities. And the way we approached it is we mobilized the capital to think what are the challenges for this particular local community, so that it's not a copy-paste policy that everybody says they have the same problems, because they don't. And second, we sort of tried to invest in the social capital that was built so that they can implement the policies that they want to have, and they ultimately claimed for their projects from the regional funds and from the development funds. So it's not an easy process, it takes time, but we need to see if, even if there's money, there's capacity to claim this money to implement projects that help the local communities
to develop. So a combination of money and technical assistance also. I think, Mr. Giegold, you wanted to say something?
Well, I wanted to react very briefly on 2 points made. So what is the simplification potential? I agree very much with your proposal. Those regions which have performed well to be reliable, low fraud, high effectiveness, there should be less controls, more subsidiarity, those regions where there are more signs of problems, there should be stricter measures. Of course, this puts a very difficult task to Elisa, having to differentiate, which is always difficult in Europe, but this is a good idea in order to cut red tape. A second point I wanted to make, even if it's not the nicest message to the cohesion community, I would say, we have to take the results, the empirical results of the cohesion report seriously. If there is persistent development traps, more money and simply continuation of current cohesion policy will not solve the problem. These regions, and that's what the figures have shown, have received for a long time cohesion funds, and they are still in the trap. And these people deserve better. And therefore, when we design the next period, we have to get a response to it in order to protect the legitimacy of cohesion policy, not in order to call it into question. And for this, reforms and support for reforms are key. And what has been said on the European semester, look, I was 12 years with Elisa, a long time of that, in Econ. I followed in the European Parliament the semester. And I have to say, not everything recommended by the Commission is great, but more or less, the recommendations are good ones. They put their fingers into long-term blockades in member states. I studied at depth the German recommendations. Most of them were fully legitimate. And the biggest problem was that whatever government, we never followed these recommendations. And therefore, we can learn from RRF, helping reactors of change in the member states in order to help also better development conditions in the poorest regions. And therefore, I would not put away so simply the lesson that linking cohesion with good policy making is not centralization, but it's support for change in the member states, which will help peripheral regions, regions in development traps, which deserve better than what they get so far.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all panelists. We have arrived at the time.